A brief, intimate moment between a human and a dog often appears deceptively simple. A lean forward, a gentle contact on the head, a quiet pause. From a human perspective, this gesture is typically an instinctive expression of affection, automatic, familiar, and emotionally reassuring. However, from a canine standpoint, the same interaction activates a far more complex biological and sensory system. What feels like emotional warmth to a person is processed by a dog as a multi-dimensional data event involving scent analysis, spatial interpretation, emotional calibration, and environmental scanning, rooted in evolutionary survival mechanisms. This divergence in perception is precisely why dogs respond so differently to close physical affection. Some remain relaxed and engaged, others subtly disengage after a moment. These reactions are rarely about affection in a human sense. They are about information processing, sensory thresholds, and trust calibration. Understanding this interaction requires reframing it through the lens of canine cognition rather than human intention. 1. Olfactory intelligence and chemical interpretation. Dogs operate primarily through olfactory dominance rather than visual or auditory prioritization. Their perception of reality is constructed through scent-based intelligence systems that are vastly more sensitive than human capabilities. When a human leans in closely, the dog is immediately exposed to a concentrated stream of biological information: breath composition, skin scent, hormonal traces, and micro changes in physiological state. This is not passive exposure, it is active decoding. The canine olfactory system includes specialized structures capable of identifying chemical signatures associated with stress, fatigue, excitement, and routine changes. As a result, a dog may detect subtle shifts in its owner's condition that are imperceptible to human awareness. This is why many dogs instinctively investigate the face area after close contact. The behavior is often misinterpreted as curiosity or affection-seeking, but functionally it's a diagnostic assessment. The animal is validating environmental stability and reaffirming that its primary social reference point remains consistent and non-threatening. A calm scent profile typically produces observable relaxation responses, softened posture, slower breathing, and reduced vigilance. This is a physiological confirmation of safety rather than an emotional reaction in human terms. 2. Nervous system alignment and co-regulation. Beyond scent analysis, close physical proximity introduces a second layer of interaction: nervous system synchronization. Dogs maintain a naturally higher baseline arousal level compared to humans. Even in rest states, their sensory systems remain partially active, continuously monitoring environmental changes. This biological design supports rapid response capability, but also requires frequent regulation to maintain emotional equilibrium. Human contact, when calm and stable, can function as an external regulatory influence. Slower breathing patterns, steady posture, and controlled movement create a stabilizing effect that dogs can subconsciously mirror. This process, often described in behavioral science as physiological co-regulation, allows two nervous systems to align over time. In practical terms, a calm human presence can reduce canine stress indicators and promote emotional settling. For many dogs, this creates a reliance dynamic where proximity to a trusted human serves as a regulatory anchor. The interaction becomes less about affection in isolation and more about maintaining internal balance. However, this system is sensitive. It functions optimally within limits of duration and intensity. When exceeded, the same proximity that creates calm can shift toward overstimulation. 3. Sensory saturation and boundary signaling. Extended close-range interaction can lead to sensory overload in dogs. While initial contact may be perceived as comforting, prolonged exposure introduces excessive input across multiple sensory channels simultaneously. Key contributors include intensified scent concentration, restricted spatial freedom, direct airflow disruption, and visual field compression. Additionally, facial whiskers, highly sensitive tactile sensors, continuously relay environmental feedback that becomes increasingly dense in close proximity. When this threshold is reached, dogs typically initiate subtle disengagement behaviors, including head turning, yawning, lip licking, or physical withdrawal. These signals are not rejection behaviors in emotional terms. They function as regulatory communication mechanisms designed to reduce sensory intensity and restore internal equilibrium. From a behavioral perspective, these are boundary-setting actions that preserve cognitive stability. Importantly, dogs that feel secure are often more likely to express these signals clearly, as trust reduces the need for defensive escalation. Respecting these cues reinforce long-term relational stability. Consistent acknowledgement of boundaries strengthens the animal's perception of predictability and safety within the human interaction model. 4. Vulnerability signaling and trust architecture. In biological terms, proximity to the face represents exposure of one of the most vulnerable anatomical regions in mammals. The face contains critical sensory organs, respiration pathways, and survival-related structures. Most species interpret proximity to this zone as a potential threat. However, domesticated dogs have adapted to interpret human-initiated proximity differently due to long-term co-evolutionary exposure. When a human willingly exposes their face without defensive posture, the dog registers a significant deviation from typical predatory or competitive behavior. This absence of threat signaling is interpreted as trust-based vulnerability. Over time, repeated exposure to this pattern creates associative learning. The dog begins to link human proximity with non-aggression and environmental safety. Certain behavioral responses, such as relaxed eye closure or gentle leaning, reflect this learned association. These are not arbitrary gestures. They represent a stable internal classification of the human as a non-threatening entity within the dog's cognitive framework. In effect, the human is consistently communicating no harm, no intent to dominate, no environmental risk. This message carries more weight in canine cognition than overt expressions of affection. 5. Visual signaling and emotional interpretation. Eye behavior plays a critical role in interspecies communication. In canine social structures, direct, sustained staring can be interpreted as confrontation or dominance assertion. However, domesticated dogs have developed an advanced interpretive adaptation, allowing them to distinguish between threatening gaze patterns and affiliative human expressions. When humans engage in close contact, facial musculature typically relaxes, eyes soften, blinking becomes more natural, and tension around the brow decreases. These micro-expressions are accurately interpreted by dogs as non-threatening signals. This soft gaze functions as a regulatory cue that reduces defensive readiness and supports emotional openness. From a cognitive standpoint, the dog is not responding to affection language, but to behavioral safety indicators embedded in facial expression patterns. 6. Neurochemical bonding and mutual reinforcement. At the biochemical level, close human-dog interaction activates shared neurochemical pathways associated with attachment and social bonding. One of the central mechanisms involved is oxytocin release. This neuropeptide plays a key role in forming social bonds, reducing stress response activation, and reinforcing affiliative behavior. During calm physical interaction, both human and dog experience elevated oxytocin levels, accompanied by reductions in cortisol, the primary stress-related hormone. This creates a feedback loop in which calm interaction reinforces physiological comfort, and comfort reinforces calm interaction. The result is a bidirectional bonding mechanism that strengthens relational stability over time. Unlike purely behavioral conditioning, this process operates at a neurochemical level, making the bond both emotional and biological in nature. The outcome is a shared regulatory environment where proximity itself becomes a stabilizing input for both systems. Conclusion. What appears to be a simple, affectionate gesture is in reality a highly complex exchange of biological data, sensory interpretation, and neurochemical synchronization. Dogs do not interpret human proximity through emotional language alone. They process it through layered systems of scent analysis, boundary management, trust calibration, and physiological alignment. When these systems align successfully, the interaction produces measurable calm, mutual regulation, and reinforced attachment. When they exceed threshold limits, the same systems initiate withdrawal behaviors designed to restore balance. Ultimately, the interaction is less about expressing affection and more about maintaining a stable, reciprocal state of safety. In that sense, the quiet moment between a human and a dog becomes a sophisticated form of cross-species communication, structured, adaptive, and deeply rooted in biology.